They called her barren, useless, cursed, and her own father dragged her to the auction block to be sold like a lame horse. Lydia Monroe stood in the dust while men examined her teeth, her hips, her worth measured in what her womb refused to give. She'd already been thrown away once by a husband who wanted sons. Now she was merchandise again, waiting for the highest bidder to decide if broken women were worth feeding through winter. Then a tall stranger with sawdust in his beard stepped forward, laid down every coin he had, and said just 5 words that would remake her entire life. She won't be judged anymore. Want to know what happens next? Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far Lydia's story travels. The sun beat down on the auction block like God himself was trying to burn the shame deeper into Lydia Monroe's skin. She stood there in the center of the dusty frontier market square, her thin cotton dress clinging to her back with sweat, her hands bound loosely in front of her, not to keep her from running, but because it made the spectacle more official, more like livestock. Her father, Marcus Monroe, stood off to the side with his arms crossed, his face hard as the Montana clay beneath their feet. What am I bid for a healthy woman, 26 years old, can read and write, knows her way around a kitchen? The auctioneer's voice carried across the crowd, jovial and practiced, as if he were selling farm equipment instead of a human being. Sturdy enough? Good teeth? Won't give you trouble. Lydia kept her eyes on the horizon, on the pine-covered mountains in the distance, anywhere but on the faces of the men who circled closer. She could hear their whispers, feel their stares crawling over her like insects. That's Monroe's daughter, ain't it? The one her husband sent back? Heard she's barren, couldn't give him no children. What good's a woman who can't breed? Might as well buy a mule, at least that'll pull a plow. The words hit like stones, each one finding a bruise that hadn't quite healed. Lydia had heard them all before, in different voices, different towns, but always with the same contempt. She'd been married once to Thomas Hartford, a merchant's son who'd promised her a good life, a home, respectability. For 2 years she'd tried. 2 years of prayer and hope and tears, 2 years of watching Thomas's face grow harder each month when her courses came and no baby followed. 2 years until he'd finally looked at her across the breakfast table and said, "You're useless to me. Pack your things." He'd remarried within 6 months, to a young woman named Catherine with wide hips and a family history of twins. The whole town had celebrated the wedding, and Lydia had watched from her father's window, knowing that everyone was thinking the same thing. Finally, Thomas Hartford will have the sons he deserves. Her father had taken her back, but not out of love. Marcus Monroe was a practical man, a failed farmer with a bitter heart and debts that grew like weeds. He'd never wanted daughters in the first place. Lydia's mother had died bringing her into the world, and he'd never forgiven either of them for it. For 8 months she'd lived in his house again, doing his cooking and laundry, enduring his silence and his occasional drunken rage, until finally he'd grabbed her by the arm this morning and dragged her to town. "You're eating my food and giving me nothing," he'd said, his breath sour with whiskey. "A man's got to make use of what he's got, and you're all I got left. At least this way you'll bring me something." Now here she stood, a commodity, a failure. A woman whose only value was whatever someone was willing to pay to take her off her father's hands. "Do I hear $10, the auctioneer called. $10 for a literate woman who won't cost you much to feed?" Silence. The men shifted, looked at each other, looked away. Lydia felt her throat tighten. Even at $10, no one wanted her. "Come now, gentlemen. $8. She can cook, she can clean, she won't complain. She can't have babies," someone shouted from the back. "What's the point?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. Lydia's fingernails bit into her palms. She wanted to scream, to run, to disappear into the earth and never come back. But she stood there, frozen, because where would she run to? There was nowhere left. $8, a voice said quietly. The crowd parted, and Lydia saw him for the first time. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and arms thick with muscle from years of hard labor. His clothes were worn but clean, canvas pants, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, heavy boots caked with sawdust and mud. His hair was dark brown, almost black, and hung just past his collar. His beard was full and neatly trimmed, and his eyes, gray as a winter sky, met hers for just a moment before he looked at the auctioneer. "I'll give $8, Grant Coulter repeated, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who didn't waste words. The auctioneer perked up immediately. $8. Do I hear $9? $9, gentlemen? This is your last chance. Coulter, you sure about this? Another man called out. You know what they say about her, cursed womb. You got 4 mouths to feed already, without adding one that won't give you nothing back. Grant didn't even turn to look at the speaker. He reached into his pocket and counted out coins onto the auctioneer's table, each one clinking against the wood with finality. $8, that's my bid. The auctioneer looked around hopefully, but the crowd had already started to disperse. Nobody was going to bid against Grant Coulter, not when he'd made his mind up. The man was known as fair but stubborn, and crossing him was more trouble than it was worth. Sold, the auctioneer declared, bringing his hand down. To Grant Coulter for $8. Sir, she's yours. Lydia's father stepped forward immediately, snatching the coins before they'd finished settling. He didn't look at his daughter, didn't say goodbye or offer any words of comfort. He just counted the money twice, nodded once, and walked away into the crowd without a backward glance. Grant approached the auction block and held out his hand. Step down careful, wood's uneven. Lydia stared at his outstretched hand, calloused and scarred from years of logging work, and for a moment she couldn't move. This stranger had just bought her, owned her. She'd gone from her father's property to her husband's property to her father's property again, and now she belonged to a man whose name she'd only just heard. I won't hurt you, Grant said quietly, as if reading her hesitation. But we got a long walk ahead, and I'd like to be home before dark. She took his hand. His grip was firm but gentle as he helped her down, and he released her the moment her feet touched the ground. He nodded to the man who'd been holding the rope around her wrists, and the bonds fell away. Thank you, Lydia whispered, rubbing her wrists even though the rope hadn't been tight enough to leave marks. Grant didn't acknowledge the thanks. He just turned and started walking, and after a moment of panic, what if he leaves me here? Lydia hurried to follow. They walked through town in silence, past the general store and the saloon and the small white church where Lydia had married Thomas Hartford 5 years ago. People stared as they passed, and she heard the whispers start up again behind them. Coulter bought Monroe's daughter. Wonder what he wants with a barren woman. Must be desperate for help with those kids of his. Lydia kept her eyes down and focused on keeping pace with Grant's long strides. He walked like a man with purpose, never hurrying but never slowing, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. At the edge of town, he stopped at a wagon, more of a cart, really, rough-hewn and practical, and gestured for her to climb up. It's about an hour to my place, he said, settling onto the bench seat and taking up the reins. Up in the pines past Sawyer's Ridge, quiet up there. Lydia climbed up beside him, arranging her skirts and gripping the edge of the seat as the cart lurched into motion. The old horse pulling them looked as tired as she felt, but it plodded forward steadily, following a dirt road that wound north out of town and into the foothills. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Lydia kept stealing glances at the man beside her, trying to understand what kind of person would spend $8, probably everything he had, on a woman the whole town called cursed. Grant kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the reins, his expression unreadable. Finally, as they started climbing into higher country where the air smelled of pine sap and wood smoke, Lydia found her voice. Why did you buy me? Grant didn't answer right away. He guided the horse around a bend in the road, past a fallen log and through a shallow creek, before he finally spoke. I got 4 children. Youngest is 3, oldest is 11. Their mama died bringing the baby into the world, and I've been trying to manage on my own ever since. He paused, his jaw working as if he was chewing on the next words before letting them out. House is a mess. Kids are half wild. I work from dawn to dusk cutting timber, and I come home to chaos. I need help. There are plenty of women who could help you, Lydia said quietly. Women who could give you more children. Why choose someone like me? Grant's hands tightened on the reins, but his voice stayed level. Because every other woman in this territory looks at my kids and sees work, sees obligation, sees 4 reasons why they'd be stuck forever. He finally turned to look at her, and his gray eyes were tired but honest. I don't need someone to love me. I don't need someone to give me more children. I just need someone who isn't cruel, someone who won't see my kids as a burden. When I heard what they were saying about you at that auction, how you were used up and worthless, I thought, here's a woman who knows what it's like to be judged for something that ain't her fault. Maybe she won't judge my kids for losing their mama." The words settled between them like a promise, or maybe a plea. Lydia looked down at her hands, at the thin gold band she'd removed from her finger the day Thomas sent her away. She'd sold it to buy fabric for a dress that her father had burned when he was drunk, saying it was too fine for a woman with no prospects. "I'm not good at much," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the creak of the wagon wheels. "I burn food, I'm clumsy, I couldn't even do the one thing a woman is supposed to do." "Can you be kind?" The question caught her off guard. She looked up at Grant, but he was watching the road again, his profile carved in evening shadow. "Can you be patient with children who've forgotten how to trust?" he continued. "Can you make a house feel like it's got a roof even when the wind's howling? Can you wake up each day and try, even if yesterday was hard?" Lydia thought about the question, really thought about it. Could she? She'd spent the last 8 months wanting to disappear, believing every cruel word that had been spoken over her. But before that, before Thomas's rejection, before her father's bitterness, she remembered a girl who'd sung while she worked, who'd tended a small garden behind her mother's grave, who dreamed of being the kind of mother her own had never gotten to be. "I can try," she whispered. Grant nodded once. "Then that's enough." They crested a ridge, and suddenly the forest opened up into a clearing. A cabin sat in the center, rough-cut logs chinked with mud, a stone chimney trailing smoke into the darkening sky. It wasn't much, single-story, probably just 2 rooms, with a porch that sagged on one side and windows covered with oilcloth instead of glass. But there was a garden plot beside it, overgrown with weeds, and a shed that looked like it housed tools and firewood. Beyond the cabin, the land sloped down to a creek, and the sound of running water mixed with the rustle of wind in the pines. "It's not fancy," Grant said, bringing the cart to a stop in front of the cabin. "But it's sturdy. Roof don't leak, and the stove works good." Lydia barely heard him. She was staring at the cabin door, which had just opened. 4 children stood on the porch, arranged by height like stair steps. The oldest was a girl, maybe 11 or 12, with dark hair pulled back in a messy braid and eyes that assessed Lydia with open suspicion. Next to her stood a boy of perhaps 9, thinner than he should be, with his father's gray eyes and a guarded expression. Another boy, maybe 6, peered out from behind his sister's skirt. And in the oldest girl's arms, a little girl with golden curls and a thumb in her mouth stared at Lydia with the solemn curiosity of the very young. "Kids," Grant said, climbing down from the cart and turning to help Lydia down. "This is Lydia. She's going to be staying with us, helping out around here." The oldest girl's expression hardened. "We don't need help. Sarah?" Grant's voice held a warning. "We've been fine on our own," Sarah insisted, her chin lifting. "We don't need some stranger coming in here and—" "Enough!" Grant didn't raise his voice, but something in his tone made Sarah's mouth snap shut. "Go inside and set the table. We'll have supper soon." Sarah held Lydia's gaze for another long moment, then turned and herded the other children back into the cabin. The door closed with more force than necessary. Grant sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Don't mind Sarah. She's had to be the woman of the house since her mama passed, and she don't like giving up that position. The middle boy is James, the little one is Peter, and the baby is Lily." He started toward the cabin, then paused. "They've been hurt. They've lost their mama. They don't trust easy, and they'll test you. But they're good kids. Just be patient with them." Lydia nodded, her stomach twisting with anxiety. She'd barely managed to run her father's household, and now she was expected to care for 4 grieving children who already resented her presence. This was a mistake. She should have stayed on that auction block, should have let herself be passed over, should have— "You coming?" Grant asked from the porch. She took a deep breath and followed him inside. The cabin was exactly what she'd expected, functional but chaotic. There was a large main room with a stone fireplace, a scarred wooden table with 6 mismatched chairs, and a corner that served as a kitchen with a cast-iron stove and open shelves stocked haphazardly with supplies. Clothes hung from pegs on the wall, and muddy boots were scattered by the door. A ladder led up to a loft where Lydia could see blankets and pallets arranged for sleeping. The floor was swept but not scrubbed, and everything had the dusty, lived-in smell of a house that was occupied but not truly tended. The children had arranged themselves at the table, Sarah at one end with Lily on her lap, the boys flanking her like guards. They all watched Lydia with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity. Grant gestured to a door on the far wall. "That's my room. Small, but it's private. You'll sleep out here for now, in the corner by the stove. I'll rig up a curtain for privacy." He moved to the shelves and started pulling down supplies. "Sarah usually makes supper, but tonight I'll do it. You just settle in." Lydia looked around, feeling utterly out of place. Her small bundle of belongings, all that her father had let her take, sat by the door where Grant had placed it. She had 2 dresses, a shawl, her mother's Bible, and a hairbrush. That was her entire life now, contained in a bundle that weighed less than a newborn lamb. "I can help with supper," she offered quietly. "No." Sarah's voice was sharp. "We don't need your help. Papa can do it." "Sarah's," Grant began. "She's going to ruin everything," Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. "You bought her like you'd buy a cow, and now you expect us to just accept her? Mama's barely cold in the ground, and you're already replacing her." "That's enough." Grant's voice cracked like a whip, and the younger children flinched. Lily started to whimper. Grant immediately softened, running a hand through his hair. "Sarah, I know you're angry. I know this is hard. But your mama has been gone for 3 years, and we're drowning here. I'm trying to keep us afloat, and I can't do it alone anymore. Lydia's not here to replace your mama. Nobody could do that. She's here to help. That's all." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back furiously. She clutched Lily tighter and stared at the table, her jaw set. The silence that followed was excruciating. Lydia stood frozen, wanting to say something but having no idea what words could possibly make this better. James and Peter wouldn't even look at her. Lily had buried her face in Sarah's neck. Grant moved to the stove and started building up the fire, his movements efficient but heavy with exhaustion. "Boys, go fetch water from the creek. Sarah, get Lily ready for bed after supper. Lydia—" He paused, seeming to struggle with what to tell her. "Just sit. Rest. You've had a long day." Lydia sat at the far end of the table, as far from the children as possible. She folded her hands in her lap and tried to make herself small, invisible, unthreatening. James and Peter grabbed buckets and fled outside, clearly grateful for the excuse to escape. Sarah stayed at the table, rocking Lily and humming softly, pointedly ignoring Lydia's existence. Grant worked at the stove, frying salt pork and boiling beans, his broad back to the room. Lydia watched him move through the space with the careful competence of someone who'd learned domestic tasks out of necessity rather than inclination. When he reached for a pot on a high shelf, she saw him wince and favor his left side. An old injury, maybe, or just the accumulated toll of hard labor. The boys returned with water, slopping half of it on the floor in their haste. They set the buckets down and retreated to the table, whispering to each other and shooting glances at Lydia when they thought she wasn't looking. Finally, Grant served up the meal: fried pork, beans, hard bread, and water. It was simple but filling, the kind of food meant to fuel bodies that worked hard. He set a plate in front of Lydia without comment, then served the children before taking his own seat at the head of the table. "We thank the Lord for this food and for the day He's given us," Grant said quietly. "Amen." "Amen," the children echoed. They ate in silence. Lydia forced herself to take small bites, to chew and swallow even though her stomach was knotted with anxiety. The pork was overcooked and tough, the beans under-seasoned. She could have done better. She was certain she could have done better, but she kept her mouth shut and ate what she was given. Halfway through the meal, Lily started to fuss. She pushed her plate away and reached for Sarah, making small, distressed noises. "She's tired," Sarah said, standing up with the little girl in her arms. "I'll put her to bed." "Finish your supper first," Grant said. "I'm not hungry." Sarah carried Lily toward the ladder, murmuring soothing words that Lydia couldn't quite hear. Grant watched them go, his expression troubled, then turned his attention to the boys. "How'd the woodpile look today?" "Good," James said quietly. "Peter and I stacked everything from yesterday's cut." "That's good. Tomorrow we'll need to start on the north section. Big order came in from the mill." Grant took a long drink of water. I'll need you boys to help, so get to bed early tonight. The boys nodded and resumed eating, stealing glances at Lydia between bites. Finally, Peter, the youngest boy, spoke up, his voice small. Are you really going to live here? Peter, Grant began. It's all right, Lydia said quietly. She looked at the boy, at his wide eyes and the smudge of dirt on his cheek. Yes, I'm going to live here. Your father bought me at the auction today. Why? Peter asked. Sarah says you're broken. Peter? Grant's voice was sharp, but Lydia felt something crack open inside her chest, not with pain, but with a strange, painful honesty. Because I am broken, she said simply. I couldn't do what wives are supposed to do. I couldn't have babies. So my husband sent me away, and my father didn't want me anymore. Your father bought me because he needs help, and I need a place to be. Maybe that makes me lucky. Maybe it makes me useful after all. Peter stared at her, processing this. Mama died having Lily. Does that mean she was broken too? The air went out of the room. Grant's knuckles went white around his fork. James looked stricken. Somewhere in the loft, Sarah had gone very, very quiet. Lydia felt tears prick her eyes, but she kept her voice steady. No, sweetheart, your mama wasn't broken. Sometimes bodies just can't do what we ask them to. That doesn't mean we're broken. It just means we're human. Your mama loved you very much, and she gave everything she had to bring your sister into the world. That's not broken. That's brave. Peter thought about this, then nodded slowly and went back to his beans. James relaxed slightly. From the loft, Lydia heard the soft sound of Sarah crying, muffled into a pillow. Grant cleared his throat roughly. Boys, finish up and get ready for bed. We've got an early start tomorrow. The boys obeyed quickly, scraping their plates and washing their faces in the bucket by the door. They climbed the ladder to the loft, whispering to each other in the darkness. Lydia heard Sarah shushing them, her voice thick with tears. Grant and Lydia sat alone at the table. He stared at his empty plate, his jaw working like he was trying to figure out what to say. I'm sorry, Lydia finally whispered. I shouldn't have said no. Grant looked up at her, and his gray eyes were bright with something that might have been gratitude. Thank you. I don't know how to talk to them about their mama. I loved my wife. She was good and kind, and she didn't deserve what happened. But every time I try to explain it to them, I fail. You haven't failed, Lydia said softly. They're still here. They're still trying. That means you've done everything right. Grant studied her for a long moment, then stood and started collecting dishes. Lydia rose to help, but he waved her off. You've had a long day. I'll clean up. Tomorrow you can start figuring out how things work around here. He paused, then added, There's a pallet in the corner by the stove. Blankets are in the chest. It's not much, but it's warm. Lydia found the pallet, a thin mattress stuffed with corn husks, and the blankets, which were worn but clean. She made up her bed in the corner, aware of Grant moving around the cabin, banking the fire, checking the door, doing all the small tasks that marked the end of a day. When he finally retreated to his room and closed the door, Lydia lay down on her pallet and stared up at the rafters. She could hear the children settling in the loft above her, rustling blankets, whispered conversations, Lily's sleepy murmurs. She could hear Grant moving in his room, the creak of his bed as he lay down. She'd been bought today, sold like livestock. She was sleeping in a stranger's house, surrounded by children who didn't want her, with no idea what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in 8 months, she wasn't sleeping in her father's house, listening to him rage about her worthlessness. She wasn't lying awake in Thomas Hartford's bed, wondering what she'd done wrong. She was here, in a cabin that smelled of pine smoke and hard work, with a man who'd said the only thing he needed was someone who could be kind. Maybe that was something she could do. Maybe being kind was enough. Lydia closed her eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept without nightmares. She woke to chaos. The sun was barely up, pale light filtering through the oilcloth windows, and someone was shouting. Lydia jolted upright on her pallet, disoriented and confused, as the door to Grant's room flew open and he emerged, already dressed, his face tight with worry. Sarah, get Lily away from the stove. Lydia scrambled to her feet, her blanket tangling around her legs. In the kitchen corner, smoke was pouring from the stove. Sarah stood frozen in front of it, Lily wailing in her arms, while flames licked out from beneath a pot that had clearly been left unattended. Grant grabbed the pot with his bare hands. Lydia heard him hiss with pain and threw it out the front door, then kicked dirt over the flames that had caught on the wooden floor. The smoke began to dissipate, and the immediate danger passed, but the damage was done. The bottom of the pot was black and ruined, and the acrid smell of burned food filled the cabin. "I was just trying to make breakfast," Sarah said, her voice small and scared. "I put the porridge on, but then Lily woke up crying, and I forgot." "It's all right," Grant said, but his hands were already blistering. He plunged them into the water bucket, grimacing. "Nobody's hurt. That's what matters." The boys had come down from the loft, standing at the bottom of the ladder in their nightshirts, looking anxious. Lily was still crying, her face red and snotty. Lydia moved without thinking. She took Lily from Sarah's arms. The little girl came willingly, too upset to object, and bounced her gently, making soothing sounds. "Shh, shh. It's all right, sweetheart. Just smoke. Everything's all right." Sarah stared at her, something complex and painful crossing her face. Then she turned and ran outside. Grant started to go after her, but Lydia stopped him with a quiet word. "Let her be. She's embarrassed. She'll come back when she's ready." She looked at his hands, at the angry red marks already forming. "Those need tending. Sit down." "I'm fine." "Sit. Down." Something in her tone, not harsh but absolutely certain, made Grant obey. He sat heavily at the table while Lydia, still holding Lily, moved to the shelves and started pulling down supplies. Honey, clean cloth, a jar of rendered fat that looked like it might have herbs mixed in. "James, Peter, can you fetch fresh water?" she asked the boys. "Quick as you can." They ran to obey, glad for something useful to do. Lydia set Lily on Grant's lap. The little girl immediately grabbed his shirt and buried her face in his chest, and set to work on his hands. The burns weren't terrible, but they'd blister badly if not treated. She made a poultice with the fat and honey, bound his hands with the clean cloth, and stepped back. "That should help. Keep them clean and dry, and don't use them more than you have to for the next few days." Grant looked down at his bandaged hands, then up at her. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "My mother was a healer," Lydia said quietly. "Before she died, she taught me some. I'm not as good as she was, but I remember enough." "Thank you." The words were simple, but the gratitude in them was real. Lydia felt something warm and fragile bloom in her chest. The first hint that maybe, just maybe, she had something to offer this family after all. The boys returned with water, sloshing it onto the floor again. Lydia took the bucket without comment and started assessing what could be salvaged for breakfast. The porridge was beyond saving, but there was bread from last night, some dried apples, and a bit of honey. She cobbled together a simple meal and set it on the table. Sarah came back inside just as everyone was sitting down. Her eyes were red, but her chin was up. She sat in her usual spot and accepted her plate without looking at anyone. Grant cleared his throat. "Sarah, you're not in trouble. Accidents happen. But from now on, maybe we let Lydia handle the stove in the mornings. You've got enough to manage with the young ones." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she nodded once. A small surrender. They ate in silence again, but this time it felt less hostile and more thoughtful. The children were watching Lydia with new eyes, seeing how she'd moved through the crisis without panic, how she'd tended their father's burns, how she'd soothed Lily without being asked. After breakfast, Grant pushed back from the table. "I've got to get to the timber site. James, you're with me. Peter, you stay here and help with chores. Sarah, keep an eye on Lily." He looked at Lydia. "You can figure out what needs doing. House is yours to manage however you see fit." Then he and James were gone, leaving Lydia alone with 3 suspicious children and a cabin that desperately needed attention. She looked around at the mess, the smoky smell, the scorched floor, the dishes piled by the bucket, and took a deep breath. "All right," she said, mostly to herself. "Let's see what we can do." The first week nearly broke her. Lydia had thought she understood hard work. She'd cooked and cleaned for her father, had managed Thomas Hartford's household with its polished floors and starched linens. But this cabin, this wild, chaotic, lived-in space, demanded something different. It demanded constant attention, endless patience, and a kind of resilience she wasn't sure she possessed. She started with the floor, scrubbing the smoke stains and scorch marks until her knuckles bled. Peter watched her from the corner, sitting with his wooden soldiers arranged in careful rows, occasionally glancing up as if to make sure she was still there. Sarah had taken Lily outside to hang laundry, but Lydia could feel the girl's resentment like a physical weight pressing against her back through the walls. By midday, the floor was clean, but Lydia's back ached so badly she could barely straighten. She moved to the kitchen shelves, trying to organize the haphazard collection of supplies into something that made sense. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, a precious jar of preserved berries that looked like it dated back to Grant's wife. Lydia's hands trembled as she reached for it, wondering if she should use it or save it, if touching these remnants of the dead woman's work was somehow a violation. "She made those the summer before she died," Sarah said from the doorway. Lydia turned, startled. The girl stood with Lily on her hip, her expression unreadable. "Your mother?" Lydia asked softly. "She said they were for Christmas, but then—" Sarah's voice trailed off. "Papa won't eat them. Says it hurts too much, but he won't throw them away either." Lydia carefully placed the jar back on the shelf. "Then we'll leave them be. Some things aren't meant to be used. They're meant to be kept." Sarah studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly and went back outside. It was the closest thing to a truce they'd managed. That night, Lydia attempted to make supper. She'd watched Grant cook the night before, had seen where he kept the supplies and how he worked the stove. How hard could it be? She built up the fire, set a pot of water to boil for beans, started frying salt pork in the skillet. The children drifted in from their afternoon chores, drawn by the smell of cooking food, and settled at the table to wait. Everything seemed fine until the smoke started. Lydia had turned her attention to cutting bread and hadn't noticed the pork beginning to burn. By the time she smelled it, the meat was black on one side and the beans had boiled over, extinguishing part of the fire and filling the cabin with the acrid stench of scorched food and wet ashes. "No, no, no!" Lydia grabbed the skillet, forgetting to use a cloth, and the hot metal seared her palm. She dropped it with a cry, and it clattered to the floor, spilling burned pork across the boards she'd spent all morning scrubbing. The children stared at her. Peter's lower lip started to tremble. Sarah's expression was almost triumphant, as if this failure confirmed everything she'd suspected. Lydia stood there, her burned hand throbbing, looking at the ruined meal and the mess on the floor, and felt tears prick her eyes. She'd done exactly what she'd feared. She'd proven herself useless, incompetent, more trouble than she was worth. Grant would realize his mistake. He'd send her away just like Thomas had, just like her father had. She'd be back on that auction block, only this time no one would bid at all. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I'll clean it up. The door opened and Grant came in with James, both of them covered in sawdust and sweat from a day's work. He took in the scene immediately, the smoke, the spilled food, the children's disappointed faces, Lydia's trembling form and burned hand. Lydia braced herself for his anger, for the curse words, the thrown plates, the accusations that Thomas had hurled at her whenever she'd failed at some household task. She made herself small, her shoulders hunching, waiting for the blow. Grant set down his tools, walked to the kitchen, looked at the burned pork and extinguished fire. Then he shrugged. "It's just stew." Lydia blinked. "What?" "It's just stew. Or it was supposed to be." He moved past her to the shelves, pulling down more supplies. "We'll make something else. No harm done." "But I ruined it. I wasted the food. Food burns sometimes." Grant's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather. "Happens to me twice a week. Let me see your hand." She held it out mutely. The burn wasn't as bad as his had been, but the skin was red and blistering. Grant disappeared into his room and came back with the same jar of fat and honey Lydia had used on him. With gentle efficiency, he treated her burn and wrapped it, his large hands surprisingly deft. "There. Now sit down while I fix something. Boys, clean up that mess on the floor. Sarah, get Lily some bread and milk to tide her over." The children jumped to obey, and Lydia found herself sitting at the table, watching Grant move through the kitchen with the same steady competence he'd shown before. He salvaged what he could of the beans, fried fresh pork, and within half an hour had a simple but edible meal ready. They ate together, and nobody mentioned the burned supper. Nobody made her feel like a failure. Grant just passed the bread and asked James about the timber cutting, asked Peter about his chores, asked Sarah if Lily had napped that afternoon. Normal conversation, as if Lydia's disaster had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. After the children had gone to bed, Lydia stayed at the table, staring at her bandaged hand. Grant was banking the fire, preparing the cabin for night. "Why aren't you angry?" she finally asked. He paused, poker in hand. "About what?" "The supper, the waste. I failed at the simplest thing, and you just shrugged." Grant set down the poker and sat across from her. His gray eyes were tired but kind in the firelight. "Lydia, I bought you because I need help. That's true. But I didn't buy you expecting perfection. I bought you expecting humanity. Humans make mistakes, stew burns, hands get hurt. That's just life." "But Thomas—" She stopped, but Grant was already shaking his head. "I don't know who Thomas is, but I know what kind of man sells his wife because she couldn't give him children. And I know I'm not that kind of man." He leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "You're going to burn things. You're going to drop things. You're going to make mistakes because you're learning how we do things here, and it's different from however you did things before. That's fine. We'll figure it out together." Lydia felt something crack inside her chest, some hard shell of shame and fear that had been building for years. "I don't know why you're being kind to me." "Because that's what people should do for each other." Grant stood, stretched, winced at some pain in his back. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's a new day." But tomorrow brought more failures. She dropped a pot of water, soaking the wood floor and herself. She mixed up the salt and sugar, making coffee so sweet the boys spat it out. She tried to mend a tear in Peter's shirt and somehow made it worse. Each mistake felt like another nail in her coffin, another piece of evidence that she was exactly what the town had called her, useless. Yet Grant never raised his voice. When she dropped the pot, he just told her where to find the rags. When the coffee was ruined, he dumped it out and made a fresh pot, showing her which container held what. When she mangled Peter's shirt, he sat beside her and demonstrated the proper stitch, his large hands guiding hers with surprising patience. "You're not useless," he said one evening, after she'd apologized for the third time that day. "You're just learning. There's a difference." The children were slower to accept her. Sarah remained distant, handling Lily's care with possessive efficiency and making it clear that Lydia's help wasn't needed or wanted. James was polite but reserved, watching Lydia with his father's cautious eyes. Peter was the only one who seemed even marginally curious, occasionally asking her questions about where she'd come from or why her father had sold her. It was Lily who changed things. 2 weeks into Lydia's stay, the little girl developed a fever. It came on suddenly. One moment she was playing with her rag doll, the next she was burning up and crying inconsolably. Sarah tried everything she knew, but nothing helped. Grant was at the timber site and wouldn't be home until dark. By afternoon, Lily was so hot she was barely conscious, and Sarah was terrified. "What do we do?" the girl demanded, her veneer of competence finally cracking. "I don't know what to do." Lydia had been sweeping the porch, but she dropped the broom and came inside. One look at Lily told her this was serious. She'd seen fever like this before, had helped her mother treat it in the years before she'd died. "We need to cool her down, fast." Lydia took charge without thinking, her voice calm and certain. "Sarah, get me every cloth you have. James, bring cold water from the creek, as cold as you can get. Peter, I need you to gather willow bark from the trees by the water. Do you know what willow bark looks like?" "Yes, ma'am," Peter said, already running for the door. "Good boy, hurry." For the next hour, Lydia worked with the focused intensity her mother had taught her. She stripped Lily down to her underclothes and wrapped her in cool, wet cloths, changing them every few minutes as they warmed. She made a tea from the willow bark Peter brought, coaxing the feverish child to drink it in tiny sips. She sang quietly, old songs her mother had sung to her, nonsense rhymes that seemed to soothe Lily's distress. Sarah hovered nearby, bringing fresh cloths, refilling water buckets, her face tight with fear. Is she going to be all right? She's going to be fine, Lydia said with more confidence than she felt. The fever's already coming down. See? Her cheeks aren't as red. It was true. Slowly, painstakingly, Lily's temperature began to drop. By the time Grant came home, the little girl was sleeping peacefully in Lydia's arms, her breathing even and her skin cool to the touch. Grant stood in the doorway, taking in the scene, the damp cloths everywhere, the medicinal smell of willow bark, his children clustered around Lydia, and Lily curled trustingly against her chest. What happened? His voice was rough with worry. She had a fever, Sarah said, and for the first time since Lydia had arrived, there was no hostility in the girl's tone. A bad one. Lydia knew what to do. She saved her. Grant's eyes met Lydia's over Lily's golden curls. Thank you, he said simply, but the words carried a weight of emotion that made Lydia's throat tighten. It's what anyone would have done, she managed. No, Grant said quietly. It's what someone who cares would have done. That night, after Lily had been settled in the loft with Sarah watching over her like a hawk, Grant brought Lydia a cup of tea. Real tea, not the chicory substitute they usually drank, and it was hot and sweet and perfect. You should rest, he said. You've been up with her all day. Lydia wrapped her hands around the cup, savoring the warmth. I couldn't rest until I knew she was all right. Grant sat down across from her, his hands wrapped around his own cup. Where did you learn healing? My mother. She was the closest thing our town had to a doctor. People came to her when they were sick or hurt, and she'd fix them up as best she could. Lydia smiled at the memory. I used to watch her work, and she'd explain everything she was doing. Why this herb helped fevers, why that poultice drew out infection. She said healing was just paying attention to the patient, to the signs, to what the body was trying to tell you. She sounds like she was a good woman. She was. She died when I was 8, bringing me into the world. My father never forgave either of us for it. Grant was quiet for a moment. When my wife died, I blamed everyone. The midwife, God, myself, even Lily for being born. It took me a long time to understand that sometimes bodies just give out, that death isn't always somebody's fault. Do you still blame Lily? No. Grant's voice was firm. She's innocent. She didn't ask to be born any more than you asked to be born. Your father was wrong to blame you, just like I was wrong to blame her. They sat in comfortable silence, drinking their tea. Outside, the pines whispered in the night wind, and somewhere an owl called. It was peaceful, this moment, and Lydia realized with surprise that she felt safe here. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. The next morning, Grant left something on the table before he went to work. It was a scrap of paper with words written in a careful, blocky hand. Thank you for taking care of Lily. You are good at this. Lydia held the note for a long time, her eyes burning. Nobody had ever thanked her for just being herself, for using the skills her mother had given her. In Thomas's house, nothing she did had ever been good enough. In her father's house, she'd been invisible unless she was being blamed for something. But here, in this rough cabin with this quiet lumberjack and his wounded children, she was seen. She was valued. She tucked the note into her mother's Bible and got to work. Over the following weeks, things began to shift. The children still tested her. Peter accidentally knocked over her sewing basket. James forgot to tell her they were out of flour until she was halfway through making bread. But the tests felt less malicious and more curious, as if they were trying to figure out who she was and whether she'd stay. Sarah remained the most resistant, but even she began to thaw. One afternoon, Lydia found the girl struggling to braid Lily's hair, the little one squirming and fussing. "May I?" Lydia asked quietly. Sarah hesitated, then handed over the comb with obvious reluctance. Lydia sat on the porch step and pulled Lily onto her lap, working the tangles out gently while humming. Sarah watched, her expression complicated. "Your mother had beautiful hair," Lydia said softly. "I can see where Lily gets hers. How do you know what Mama looked like?" "I don't, but I can see her in all of you, in the way you care for your brothers and sister, in the way James watches out for Peter, in the way your father talks about her." Lydia finished the braid and tied it off with a scrap of ribbon. You're all pieces of her. That means she's still here, in a way. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I'm forgetting her face, she whispered. Sometimes I try to remember and I can't see her clearly anymore. Does that mean I'm a bad daughter? Oh, sweetheart, no. Lydia wanted to hug the girl, but didn't dare. Memory isn't about seeing faces. It's about feeling love. And you love her so much I can see it in everything you do. That's not forgetting. That's honoring. Sarah wiped her eyes roughly. I didn't want you here. I thought you were trying to take her place. I could never take her place. I wouldn't want to. But maybe there's room for both of us. Your mama in your memories and me in your present. Not as a replacement, just as someone else who cares about you. The girl didn't respond, but when she went back inside, she didn't slam the door. It was progress. 3 weeks after Lydia's arrival, Grant announced they needed to go into town for supplies. Lydia's stomach clenched with anxiety. She hadn't been back to town since the auction, hadn't faced the people who'd watched her being sold like livestock. But they needed flour and sugar and other staples the cabin was running low on, and Grant wanted her to come along to help choose what they needed. You don't have to come, he said, reading her hesitation. Sarah can manage here with the kids. But Lydia thought about the note he'd left her, about the way he'd treated her burns and her failures with equal patience. If he could show her that kindness, the least she could do was face a few judgmental stares. I'll come, she said. They took the wagon into town on a Saturday morning, the kind of bright autumn day that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Grant drove in his usual silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Lydia had learned that he wasn't a man who needed to fill quiet with words. He spoke when he had something worth saying and stayed silent the rest of the time. As they rolled into town, Lydia felt the stares begin. People stopped their conversations to watch the wagon pass. Women whispered behind their hands. Men nodded to Grant, but their eyes lingered on Lydia with curiosity or contempt. Ignore them, Grant said quietly. They don't matter. But they did matter, at least to Lydia. These were the people who'd watched her being sold, who'd called her cursed and broken. Their opinions might not change her circumstances, but they still had the power to wound. Grant stopped the wagon in front of the general store and helped Lydia down. Inside, the store was crowded with Saturday shoppers, and the conversations died when they entered. Mrs. Patterson, the store owner's wife, was behind the counter, and her eyebrows rose when she saw them. Mr. Coulter and Miss Monroe? Or is it Mrs. Coulter now? Just Lydia, she said quietly. How interesting. Mrs. Patterson's tone made it clear she found it anything but interesting. What can I help you with? Grant handed over a list, and while Mrs. Patterson gathered the supplies, Lydia wandered the aisles, trying to look interested in the merchandise and not at the people who were definitely whispering about her. She was examining a bolt of fabric when she heard the voice. Well, well, if it isn't the barren bride. Lydia's blood turned to ice. She turned slowly to find Eleanor Hartford, Thomas's mother, standing behind her, flanked by a younger woman in an expensive dress and a smug expression. Catherine, Thomas's new wife. Mrs. Hartford, Lydia said, fighting to keep her voice steady. I heard you'd been sold at auction. Eleanor's smile was sharp as a knife. How fitting. My son tried to make something of you, but you couldn't even manage the most basic function of a wife. Now you're cleaning some lumberjack's cabin like the servant you should have been from the start. That's enough, Lydia said quietly, but her hands were shaking. Is it? Catherine spoke up, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. I just want you to know, Lydia, that I'm expecting. 3 months along. Thomas is so happy. We're hoping for a boy, of course, but he says he'll love any child I give him. Any child at all. The words were designed to hurt, and they did. Lydia felt each one like a physical blow, felt the old shame and inadequacy rising up to choke her. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Such a pity you're broken, Eleanor continued. A woman who can't bear children is hardly a woman at all, is she? More like a defective product. No wonder you ended up on an auction block. I said that's enough. The voice was low and cold as a mountain stream in winter. Grant had come up behind Lydia, and his presence seemed to fill the entire store. He wasn't a tall man by frontier standards, but he was broad and solid, and there was something in his eyes that made Eleanor Hartford take a step back. "Mr. Coulter," she said, trying to recover her composure, "I was just having a conversation with—" "You were trying to hurt someone who never did anything to you." Grant's voice was quiet, but everyone in the store could hear him. The whispers had stopped. Everyone was watching. "That makes you cruel, and I don't have patience for cruel people." "She's barren," Eleanor protested. "She's useless. Lydia makes my house feel like it has a roof," Grant interrupted, and his hand came to rest gently on Lydia's shoulder. "She took care of my daughter when she was sick with fever. She learns my children's favorite songs and sings them at bedtime. She knows how to draw infection from a wound and when to use willow bark for pain. She gets up every morning and tries even when she's tired, even when things are hard. That's not useless. That's the most valuable thing a person can be." The store was completely silent now. Catherine's smug expression had faltered. Eleanor's face had gone red. "My son said—" "I don't care what your son said. I don't know him, and I don't need to. I know Lydia. I know she's good and kind and worth 10 of anyone who'd throw a woman away for something beyond her control." Grant's gray eyes swept the store, taking in all the watching faces. "If anyone else has something cruel to say about her, say it to me. But know that if you do, you'll answer for it." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Grant nodded once, picked up the supplies Mrs. Patterson had gathered, and guided Lydia toward the door with his hand still on her shoulder, steady and sure. They were outside, loading the wagon, before Lydia could breathe again. Her whole body was shaking, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of shame this time. They were something else. Relief, gratitude, something she couldn't quite name. "You didn't have to do that," she managed. "Yes, I did." Grant finished loading the last sack of flour and turned to face her. "Nobody gets to talk to you like that. Not while you're with me." But she was right. "You are not broken." Grant's voice was firm. "You're different from what they expected, but that doesn't make you broken. It makes you human." He paused, then added quietly, "My wife couldn't bear children easily. We lost 3 before Sarah. The doctor said each pregnancy was dangerous, that she should stop trying. But she wanted a family so badly, and I loved her, so we kept trying. And eventually it killed her." Lydia stared at him. "I didn't know." "Most people don't. They just see 4 children and assume it was easy. But it wasn't. It was painful and scary, and it cost us everything in the end." Grant's eyes were distant, remembering. "Sometimes I wonder if I was wrong to let her keep trying. If I should have said, 'No, we have enough. Let's just be grateful for what we have.' Maybe she'd still be alive if I had." "You can't blame yourself for loving her." "I know. Just like you can't blame yourself for your body not doing what someone else wanted it to do." He met her eyes again. "You're not broken, Lydia. You're just carrying wounds that other people gave you, but wounds can heal. I've seen you start to heal already these past few weeks." They rode home in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Lydia kept thinking about what Grant had said, about the way he'd stood beside her in that store. Nobody had ever defended her like that. Not Thomas, not her father, not anyone. She'd been alone her entire life, fighting her own battles with no one in her corner. But now she had someone. This quiet lumberjack who bought her at an auction and asked for nothing except that she be kind, who left her thank you notes and taught her patience and stood between her and cruelty without hesitation. She didn't know what to call what she felt. It wasn't love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was something warm and fierce and protective. A feeling like coming home after a long journey. Like maybe, finally, she'd found a place where she could stop being afraid. When they got back to the cabin, the children rushed out to greet them. Peter wanted to know if Grant had brought candy. James helped unload supplies. Sarah took one look at Lydia's red eyes and asked quietly, "What happened?" "Nothing important," Lydia said, and realized it was true. What Eleanor and Catherine had said didn't matter anymore. Their cruelty had no power here, in this clearing surrounded by pines, with these children who were learning to trust her, and this man who'd called her valuable. That night, after everyone was asleep, Lydia found another note on the table. Just 2 words this time in Grant's careful hand. "You're brave." She held the scrap of paper and let herself cry, not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen, truly seen, by someone who didn't need her to be anything other than what she was. The rumors started in late October when Catherine Hartford appeared at the general store looking pale and drawn, her hand pressed to her stomach in a way that made the other women exchange knowing glances. Mrs. Patterson had asked gently if she was feeling well, if the baby was giving her trouble, and Catherine had burst into tears right there by the flour barrels. Lydia heard about it 3 days later when she went to town alone to pick up thread for mending. The women at the store fell silent when she entered, but she caught the tail end of their conversation, something about doctors and lies, and Thomas Hartford's rage. Mrs. Patterson looked at Lydia with something that might have been pity or vindication. She couldn't tell which. "Did you hear?" the woman asked, her voice pitched low even though they were the only ones in the store. "About Catherine Hartford?" Lydia's stomach tightened. "No, ma'am. She wasn't pregnant after all. Never was. She'd been stuffing her dresses with padding, telling Thomas what he wanted to hear. Dr. Riley examined her last week when she claimed she was bleeding, said there was no baby and never had been. Thomas threw her out, sent her back to her family in disgrace." The words should have brought satisfaction, some sense of justice for all the cruel things Catherine had said, but Lydia just felt hollow. "That's sad," she said quietly, "for everyone involved." Mrs. Patterson looked surprised, as if she'd expected Lydia to gloat. "You're kinder than most would be, given how she treated you." Being cruel back won't fix anything. Lydia selected her thread and paid for it. "It just makes more cruelty in the world." She was halfway back to the wagon when she heard footsteps behind her, fast and urgent. "Lydia! Lydia, wait!" She turned to find Thomas Hartford jogging toward her, his face flushed and desperate. He looked older than she remembered, lines of stress carved deep around his eyes and mouth. His clothes were rumpled, his hair uncombed. This wasn't the composed merchant's son who'd thrown her out 2 years ago. This was a man coming apart at the seams. "Thomas?" She kept her voice neutral, her hands tight on her package. "I need to talk to you, please." He reached for her arm, but she stepped back. "Lydia, I made a terrible mistake. Catherine, she lied to me. She made a fool of me. But you were always honest. You never lied." "No," Lydia agreed. "I just couldn't give you what you wanted. There's a difference. I was wrong to send you away. I see that now. I was angry and disappointed, but I should have been patient. We could have adopted, or we could have just accepted it was the two of us." His words tumbled out in a rush, desperate and pleading. "Come back to me, please. I'll make it right. We can start over. I'll tell everyone I was wrong, that you're my wife, and you always will be." Lydia stared at him, at this man who'd once been her whole world. She remembered loving him, or thinking she loved him. Remembered lying awake beside him, hoping each month would be different, that she'd finally be enough. Remembered the crushing disappointment in his eyes every time her courses came, the growing coldness in his touch, until finally there was nothing left but his anger and her shame. "No," she said simply. Thomas blinked. "What?" "No, I won't come back to you." But, Lydia, I'm offering you your life back, your home, your position in society. You won't have to live in some backwoods cabin doing servant's work. You'll be Mrs. Hartford again, respected, cared for. I'd rather sweep ashes for Grant Coulter than sit in your parlor as a trophy." The words came out calm and certain, and Lydia realized she meant every syllable. "You didn't want me, Thomas. You wanted a woman who could give you sons and make you look successful. When I couldn't do that, I became invisible to you. You looked through me like I was glass, like I didn't matter at all. I was young and stupid. You were cruel. You threw me away the moment I couldn't serve your purposes. You made me believe I was broken, worthless, a failure as a woman. And now that your new wife has humiliated you, you come crawling back not because you love me, but because you're desperate and alone and you think I'm so pathetic, I'll take you back just to escape my circumstances." Thomas's face flushed red. "That's not... I do care about you. Maybe you do, in your way, but it's not enough." Lydia held his gaze, and for the first time since she'd known him, she felt no fear of his judgment. "Grant Coulter sees me every day. Not the woman I should be or the woman I might have been, just the woman I am. And somehow, That's enough for him. His children are learning to trust me. They're teaching me their songs and their games and the names they've given to the trees around their cabin. I'm building something real there, Thomas. Something that isn't about what my body can or can't do. It's about who I choose to be. You're choosing poverty over comfort, obscurity over respect. I'm choosing honesty over pretense. I'm choosing a man who thanks me for burning stew over one who made me feel worthless for being human. She took a step back toward the wagon. I hope you find what you're looking for, Thomas. I hope you find a woman who can give you the children you want and make you happy. But I'm not that woman, and I never was. Let me go. Lydia, let me go. She turned and walked away from him, her heart pounding but her steps steady. Behind her, she heard Thomas call her name once more, but she didn't look back. She climbed into the wagon, took up the reins, and guided the old horse toward the road that led home. The words settled into her mind as she drove, feeling both strange and right. Home. Not her father's house, not Thomas's parlor, but a rough cabin in the pines where a quiet man left her thank you notes and 4 children were learning to trust again. That was home now. That was where she belonged. She was still thinking about it when she reached the cabin and found chaos waiting. Sarah was on the porch with Lily crying in her arms, and both boys were in the yard looking worried. "What happened?" Lydia called, climbing down quickly. "Papa's not back yet," Sarah said, her voice tight with anxiety. "He said he'd be home by noon, but it's past 3 now. He's never late. Never." Lydia felt her stomach clench. Grant was many things, but unreliable wasn't one of them. If he said he'd be home by noon, something must have prevented him. Did he say where he was working today? North section, past the ridge. But Lydia, we're not supposed to go there alone. Papa says it's too dangerous. Fallen logs, steep drops. I know. You stay here with the children. I'll go find him. Lydia was already moving toward the shed where Grant kept his tools. You can't go alone, James protested, following her. I should come. No, your father would skin me alive if I took you into dangerous territory. You stay here and watch your sisters and brother. I'll be back soon. She grabbed a coil of rope and a hunting knife, then set off toward the north section at a jog. The afternoon sun was already sinking toward the mountains, and she had maybe 2 hours of good light left. The path was rough, winding through dense pine forest and over rocky outcroppings that made her grateful for her sturdy boots. She'd gone maybe a mile when she heard voices ahead, men's voices, rough and mocking. Lydia slowed, moving quietly, and peered through the trees. Grant was there, backed against a massive fallen log, his face bruised and bleeding. 3 men surrounded him, and Lydia recognized one of them immediately, Fergus Tate, a trapper who came through town occasionally, usually drunk and always looking for trouble. The other 2 she didn't know, but they had the same mean, hungry look as Fergus. "Come on, Coulter," Fergus was saying, his words slurred. "We just want a little of what you got. Heard you bought yourself a woman at auction. Must be desperate for company up in that cabin of yours. Thought maybe you'd be willing to share." "Get off my land," Grant said, his voice cold despite the blood running from his split lip. "Or what? You gonna stop us? You're 1 man, Coulter. We're 3, and we're curious about that woman of yours. What's she like? She really as barren as they say, or were you just hoping for cheap labor?" Grant's hands curled into fists. "Last warning, leave now, or I'll make you leave." Fergus laughed and lunged forward, and suddenly they were fighting, 3 against 1, fists flying, bodies crashing into trees and rocks. Grant was strong and knew how to fight, but he was outnumbered and already injured. Lydia watched him go down under a vicious punch to his ribs, saw him struggle to get up, and something snapped inside her. She burst from the trees, the hunting knife in her hand, and screamed at the top of her lungs. "Get away from him!" The men whirled around, startled. Fergus's eyes widened when he saw her, then narrowed with cruel interest. "Well, well, speak of the devil, come to save your man, sweetheart? I came to tell you that if you don't leave right now, I'll gut you like the pig you are." Lydia's voice was steady, the knife held low and ready, the way her mother had taught her years ago. "And if you think I won't, you're wrong. I've got nothing left to lose and every reason to fight." One of the other men laughed nervously. "She's bluffing." "Try me," Lydia said flatly. Grant had pulled himself upright, using the fallen log for support. Blood dripped from his nose and mouth, but his eyes were blazing. You heard her. Leave. Now. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Fergus spat on the ground and gestured to his companions. This ain't worth it. Come on, let them have their pathetic little life. The three men backed away, still watching Lydia and Grant warily, then turned and disappeared into the forest. Lydia waited until she couldn't hear their footsteps anymore before she dropped the knife and ran to Grant. Are you hurt badly? Can you walk? I can walk. Grant's voice was rough. He touched his ribs gingerly and winced. Might have cracked a rib or two. Nothing that won't heal. We need to get you home. The children are worried sick. They made their way back slowly, Grant leaning on Lydia more than he probably wanted to admit. By the time they reached the cabin, full dark had fallen, and the children were on the porch with a lantern, their faces white with fear. Papa! Sarah ran to him, then stopped when she saw the blood. What happened? Just a disagreement with some men who didn't understand property lines, Grant said, trying to sound casual. Nothing to worry about. But James had seen enough fights to know this was serious. Should we fetch the doctor? No, doctor. Lydia can patch me up. She's done it before. Grant made it into the cabin and collapsed into a chair at the table, breathing hard. Lydia immediately went into the focused calm of healing work. She heated water, gathered her supplies, and set about cleaning Grant's wounds. His lip was split, his nose had bled but wasn't broken, and his ribs were badly bruised but probably not fractured. She worked efficiently, her hands steady even though her heart was still racing from the confrontation in the woods. The children watched in silence. Sarah held Lily close. The boys stood like sentries by their father's side. You shouldn't have come after me, Grant said quietly as Lydia wrapped his ribs. Those men were dangerous. So am I, apparently. Lydia's hands trembled slightly as she tied off the bandage. When I saw them hurting you, I didn't think. I just reacted. You threatened to gut Fergus Tate. I meant it too. Grant caught her hand, stopping her nervous movements. His gray eyes met hers, and there was something in them she'd never seen before, something warm and fierce and protective. Thank you for coming after me, for defending me. Nobody's ever done that before. Well, someone should. You deserve defending. They held each other's gaze for a long moment, and Lydia felt something shift between them, some invisible line being crossed. Then Lily started fussing, and the spell broke. The next few days were tense. Grant healed quickly, but the incident with Fergus had shaken something loose in all of them. Lydia found herself constantly on edge, jumping at sounds, watching the tree line for movement. The children stayed closer to the cabin, their earlier adventurousness replaced by wariness. It was Sarah who finally voiced what they were all thinking. What if those men come back? Grant looked up from the harness he was mending. They won't. Fergus knows I'll report him to the marshal if he tries anything again, and he knows Lydia's not someone to mess with. Peter giggled at that, and even James cracked a smile. The tension eased slightly, but didn't disappear entirely. Then, on a cold November morning, disaster struck. James and Peter had gone out early to check the trap line Grant had set near the creek. Lydia was making breakfast while Grant split firewood, the steady thunk of the axe providing a rhythm to the morning. Sarah was braiding Lily's hair on the porch when they heard the scream. It was high and terrified and unmistakably Peter's voice. Grant dropped the axe and ran, Lydia right behind him. They found the boys by the creek, James kneeling in the mud, Peter lying in his arms with blood pouring from a gash on his leg where he'd slipped on wet rocks and fallen onto something sharp. Papa, Papa, he's bleeding so much. James's voice was panicked, his hands pressed uselessly against the wound. Grant scooped Peter up, and the boy's scream of pain cut through the morning air. They ran back to the cabin, Grant bellowing for Sarah to clear the table, Lydia already mentally cataloging what she'd need. They laid Peter on the table, and Lydia got her first good look at the wound. It was bad, a jagged tear that went deep into the muscle, blood pumping out with each of the boys' racing heartbeats. She'd seen injuries like this before, had helped her mother stitch men back together after logging accidents. But this was different. This was a child. This was Grant's child. Lydia. Grant's voice was steady, but his face was gray. Tell me you can fix this. She met his eyes. I can fix this. But I need you to hold him down, and I need the rest of you out of the cabin. Now." Sarah started to protest, but Grant cut her off. "Take Lily and James to the shed. Wait there until we call for you. Go." The children fled, Sarah dragging James by the arm. Lydia heard Lily crying as the door closed behind them. "All right, Peter, listen to me." Lydia kept her voice calm as she pulled out her needle and thread, as she heated her knife in the fire for sterilization. "This is going to hurt. It's going to hurt a lot. But your papa is going to hold you, and I'm going to make you better. Do you understand?" Peter nodded, tears streaming down his face. He was only 6 years old, so brave and so terrified at the same time. Grant positioned himself at the head of the table, his large hands gentle, but firm on Peter's shoulders. "I've got you, son. I'm right here." Lydia poured whiskey over the wound. Peter screamed and began to work. She cleaned out debris, dirt, bits of bark, trying not to think about infection and fever and all the things that could still go wrong. Then she threaded her needle and started to stitch. Peter thrashed despite Grant's hold, his screams echoing off the cabin walls. Lydia had to stop twice when her hands shook too badly, had to take deep breaths and force herself to continue. Grant murmured constant reassurance, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Almost done, Peter. Almost done. You're so brave. You're the bravest boy I know." Finally, blessedly, the last stitch was in place. Lydia bandaged the leg with shaking hands, then stepped back. Peter had gone limp, not unconscious, but utterly exhausted from pain and fear. "Is it over?" he whispered. "It's over." Lydia brushed his sweaty hair back from his forehead. "You did so well, sweetheart. So well." Peter's eyes found hers and his lip trembled. "Don't cry, Mama." The world stopped. Lydia froze, her hand still on Peter's forehead, the word hanging in the air between them like something precious and fragile. "What did you say?" she whispered. "Don't cry, Mama. I'm okay now." Lydia realized she was crying, tears streaming down her face unchecked. She looked at Grant, and he was crying too, his expression torn between grief and joy and something too complex to name. "I'm not," Lydia started, but the words died in her throat. Because Peter's eyes were already closing, exhaustion pulling him under, and he looked peaceful now, trusting. Safe. Grant carefully lifted his son and carried him to the loft, Lydia following with blankets and water. They made Peter comfortable, and Grant stayed with him while Lydia went to fetch the other children. She found them huddled in the shed, Lily crying in Sarah's lap, James white-faced and scared. When they saw her, they all started talking at once. "Is Peter all right? Is he going to die?" "There was so much blood. He's going to be fine," Lydia said, and her voice only shook a little. "He'll need to rest for a few days, and the leg will be sore for a while, but he's going to be fine. Your papa is with him now." Relief flooded their faces. Sarah stood, still holding Lily, and looked at Lydia with new eyes. "You saved him." "I did what needed doing." "No." Sarah's voice was firm. "You saved him. Just like you saved Lily when she had the fever. You keep saving us." James nodded in agreement, and even Lily had stopped crying to stare at Lydia with something like wonder. That night, after Peter had woken and eaten a little broth, after the other children had gone to bed, Grant and Lydia sat at the table in the firelight. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Grant broke the silence. "He called you Mama." "I know." Lydia's hands were wrapped around a cup of tea, but she couldn't seem to make herself drink it. I never expected." "My wife, Anna, she loved those children more than anything. When she died, I thought that was it. They'd lost their mother, and nobody could ever fill that space." Grant's voice was rough with emotion. "But today, watching you fight to save Peter, seeing how much you care, I realized Anna would have wanted this. She would have wanted someone to love them the way you're learning to love them." "I don't know if I'm loving them right," Lydia whispered. "I don't know what I'm doing most of the time. I'm just trying to be there, to be kind, to not fail them." "That's all any parent does. We're all just trying not to fail them." Grant reached across the table and took her hand. His was rough and calloused, warm and steady. "You're not replacing Anna. You could never replace her. But you're becoming something else, something just as important. You're becoming their mama, Lydia. Not because you gave birth to them, but because you choose them every single day. The tears came again, and this time Lydia didn't try to stop them. I'm so scared I'll let them down. You won't. I've seen you. You'd walk through fire for those kids. You already have. Over the next few days, as Peter healed and regained his strength, something shifted in the cabin. Sarah started asking Lydia questions: how to cook certain dishes, how to treat common injuries, the songs Lydia's mother used to sing. James brought her wildflowers he'd found, placing them awkwardly on the table with a mumbled, "Thought you might like these, Mama Lydia." Even Lily, who'd always been reserved around her, started reaching for Lydia when she was tired or scared, her small arms wrapping around Lydia's neck with complete trust. And Peter, brave, injured Peter, never stopped calling her Mama. He said it casually, naturally, as if she'd always been his mother, and this was simply acknowledging reality. "Mama, can you help me with my letters?" "Mama, James is being mean." "Mama, will you tell Papa I'm well enough to go outside?" Each time the word struck Lydia like a bell, resonating through her entire being. She'd spent years believing she'd never be a mother, that her body's failure had closed that door forever. But here were 4 children calling her Mama, not because she'd given birth to them, but because she'd chosen to stay, to care, to love them through their pain and her own inadequacy. One evening, about a week after Peter's accident, Lydia was tucking Lily into bed in the loft when the little girl grabbed her hand. "Mama?" The word was slurred with sleep, barely audible. Lydia's breath caught. "Yes, sweetheart." "I don't remember my first mama very much. Sarah says she was beautiful. Was she?" Lydia thought carefully about how to answer. "I never met her, but I know she must have been beautiful because you're beautiful and you have her eyes. Your papa says she was kind and brave and that she loved all of you more than anything in the world." Lily nodded slowly, processing this. "Sarah says you're not trying to replace her." "I'm not. I could never replace her. She was your mother first, and she'll always be your mother. But maybe there's room for both of us. Your first mama in your memories and in your papa's stories, and me here now, taking care of you and loving you. Can I have 2 mamas? I think you can have as much love as people are willing to give you, and I'm willing to give you all the love I have." Lily smiled, her eyes already closing. "Good. I like having 2 mamas. One in heaven and one here." She was asleep before Lydia could respond, but Lydia sat there for a long time, watching the child breathe, feeling the weight and wonder of what she'd become. A mama. Not through blood, but through choice. Through showing up every day and trying, even when she failed. Through staying when leaving would have been easier. She climbed down from the loft to find Grant waiting by the fire, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. He looked up when she appeared, and his expression was soft in the firelight. "They're all asleep?" Finally, Peter fought it as long as he could, but exhaustion won. Lydia sat down across from him. "Grant, I need to tell you something." "All right." "Thomas asked me to come back to him. When I was in town last week, Catherine's lie was exposed, and he was desperate and alone, and he thought I'd jump at the chance to reclaim my old life." Grant's expression didn't change, but his grip tightened on his cup. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd rather sweep your ashes than sit in his parlor as a trophy. I told him you see me as a person, not just a function. And I told him this is where I belong now." Lydia met his eyes. "I chose this, Grant. I chose you and the children and this life. Not because I had no other option, but because this is where I want to be." Something in Grant's face cracked open, revealing the emotion he usually kept locked away. "I bought you at an auction. You didn't have a choice in coming here." "No, but I have a choice in staying, and I choose to stay." Grant set down his cup and stood, moving around the table to kneel beside her chair. He took both her hands in his, and his eyes were bright with tears he didn't bother to hide. "Lydia Monroe, you came to us broken and scared, and somehow you've made us whole. Those children upstairs love you. They need you. And His voice caught. "I need you too. Not as a housekeeper or a nurse or someone to manage the children. I need you as a partner, as someone who understands what it means to build a life from broken pieces, as someone who fights for the people she loves. Grant, I'm not asking you to love me. I know it's too soon for that. Maybe it'll always be too soon. But I'm asking you to stay. Not as something I bought, but as someone who belongs here, who chose to belong here. Lydia felt tears slip down her cheeks. I already told you I'm staying. Then stay as my wife. Not in name only, not as a transaction, but as a real marriage, as partners building a life together. The question hung between them, enormous and terrifying and full of possibility. Lydia thought about Thomas, who'd married her for her utility and thrown her away when she couldn't provide it. She thought about her father, who'd sold her like livestock. She thought about all the ways she'd been told she wasn't enough, would never be enough. Then she thought about Grant leaving her thank you notes, about him defending her in the general store, about him trusting her with his children's lives, about 4 kids who called her mama because she'd earned the name through love and presence, not through biology. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll stay as your wife. Grant pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, letting herself be held by this man who'd given her everything she'd thought she'd lost: purpose, family, home, and the chance to be enough exactly as she was. Outside, the November wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled. But inside the cabin, surrounded by sleeping children and firelight and the steady beating of Grant Coulter's heart, Lydia finally felt safe. They were married on a Sunday morning in late November, in the same small white church where Lydia had once pledged herself to Thomas Hartford. But this time felt different in every way that mattered. There was no elaborate ceremony, no crowd of well-wishers dressed in their finest, just Grant in his cleanest shirt, Lydia in a simple blue dress Sarah had helped her alter, and 4 children standing as witnesses to promises made not from obligation, but from choice. The minister, Reverend Carson, had looked surprised when they'd appeared at his door asking for marriage, but he'd agreed without question. Now he stood before them, his worn Bible open, speaking words about love and faithfulness that Lydia had heard before but was truly hearing for the first time. Do you, Grant Coulter, take Lydia Monroe to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do. Grant's voice was steady, his gray eyes locked on Lydia's. And do you, Lydia Monroe, take Grant Coulter to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Lydia thought about the auction block, about standing in the dust while men assessed her worth. She thought about Grant stepping forward with every coin he had, about the way he'd said she wouldn't be judged anymore. She thought about 4 children learning to call her mama, about notes left on tables, about being defended in a general store and fought for in the woods. I do, she said, and meant it with her entire soul. Grant slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, not new, but carefully polished, and she realized with a start that it had belonged to Anna. Later, he would tell her that he'd asked Sarah's permission first, that his daughter had cried and said Anna would have wanted Lydia to have it. For now, Lydia just felt the weight of it, warm and solid, a circle with no beginning and no end. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride. Grant cupped Lydia's face in his calloused hands and kissed her gently, reverently, as if she were something precious. Behind them, Peter made a gagging sound and James elbowed him quiet. Sarah held Lily and cried softly, happy tears this time. They walked out of the church as husband and wife, and Lydia realized she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in years. Mrs. Patterson was standing across the street and watched them pass, her expression thoughtful. She nodded once at Lydia, a gesture that might have been respect or at least acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was something. The winter that followed was hard but good. Snow came early and stayed late, piling up against the cabin walls and turning the world into a hushed, white cathedral. Grant worked when he could, cutting timber on the days when the weather allowed, but mostly they stayed close to home, huddled around the fire while wind howled outside. Lydia learned to be a wife to Grant in the quiet, steady way he needed. She learned that he liked his coffee strong and his eggs fried hard, that he had nightmares sometimes about losing Anna and would wake gasping in the darkness. She learned to slide her hand into his, to anchor him back to the present, to whisper that she was here, the children were here, Everyone was safe. He learned her rhythms, too, that she couldn't sleep without checking on the children one last time, that she hummed her mother's songs when she was nervous, that she needed to be useful or the old shame would creep back in. They were building something together slowly and carefully, like constructing a house one board at a time. It wasn't passion, not yet, maybe not ever, but it was partnership, and that was somehow more valuable. They were two broken people learning to be whole together, and that required patience and grace and a kind of fierce determination to not give up when things got hard. Spring came late, but when it finally arrived, Lydia felt something shift inside her. The snow melted, revealing the muddy earth beneath, and she found herself drawn to the overgrown garden plot beside the cabin. It had been neglected since Anna's death, taken over by weeds and wild grasses, but Lydia could see the bones of what it had once been: neat rows, careful planning, the work of someone who'd loved growing things. "I want to plant a garden," she told Grant one morning as they stood looking at the tangled patch. He was silent for a moment, and she wondered if she'd crossed some invisible line, tried to claim something that wasn't hers to touch. But then he nodded slowly. Anna would have liked that. She always said a house without a garden was just a shelter, not a home. So Lydia threw herself into the work with a determination that surprised even her. She cleared weeds, turned soil, divided the plot into sections with string and stakes. Sarah helped in the evenings, and together they planned what to plant: beans and squash and tomatoes, potatoes and carrots and herbs for healing. James brought her seeds he'd traded for at the general store. Peter appointed himself the official waterer, taking his job so seriously that he sometimes soaked himself along with the plants. The garden became Lydia's sanctuary, the place where she felt most herself. Her hands in the dirt, the sun on her back, the quiet satisfaction of watching things grow. It reminded her of working alongside her mother, of the garden they'd tended behind their old house. She talked to the plants sometimes, telling them about her day, about the children, about the life she was building here. If Grant thought this was strange, he never mentioned it. He'd just watch her from the porch sometimes, whittling or mending tools, a small smile on his weathered face. By early summer, the garden was flourishing. Tender shoots pushed through the earth, leaves unfurled toward the sun, and Lydia felt a fierce pride in what she'd created. The children loved it too, racing through the rows and exclaiming over each new bud, each small tomato beginning to form. Then the drought came. It started gradually, a few missed rains, warmer days than usual, but by mid-July the creeks were running low and the sky was an endless expanse of brittle blue. The earth cracked open, revealing dark wounds in the clay. The pines on the hillside began to brown, their needles dropping like rain. And Lydia's garden, her precious garden, started to wither. She fought for it with everything she had. Every morning before dawn, she hauled water from the dwindling creek, bucket after bucket, her shoulders screaming with the effort. She rigged up shade cloth to protect the most vulnerable plants. She mulched with pine needles and sawdust, anything to help the soil retain moisture. The children helped when they could, but Grant was working longer hours trying to meet his timber contracts, and Sarah had her hands full managing the household. "Lydia, you can't save all of it," Grant told her one evening as she prepared to make another trip to the creek. "The drought's too bad. You're wearing yourself out." "I can try." Her voice was stubborn. "Some of it will make it. It has to." "Why? Why does it matter so much?" She turned to look at him, and her eyes were fierce. "Because I planted it. Because I chose to put these seeds in the ground and believe they'd grow. Because giving up on it feels like giving up on everything. On us. On this life. On the idea that broken things can be made whole." Her voice cracked. "I need something to grow, Grant. I need to know that all this work means something." He pulled her into his arms, and she went, letting herself be held even though her hands were filthy and her dress was soaked with sweat and creek water. "It means something," he said quietly into her hair. "You mean something. Whether the garden lives or dies, that doesn't change." But she couldn't stop. Every day she hauled water, every day she tended and pruned and prayed. The children watched with increasing worry as she pushed herself harder and harder. Sarah started leaving food by the garden because Lydia would forget to come in for meals. James took over some of her household chores so she could focus on the plants. Even Lily tried to help, her small hands carefully pouring cupfuls of water onto the thirstiest vegetables. Most of the garden died anyway. The squash shriveled, the beans dried up on the vine, the potatoes refused to form. But in one corner, sheltered by the cabin's shadow and the last bit of moisture the soil could provide, a single tomato plant survived. It was scraggly and tough, more stem than leaf, but it clung to life with a stubbornness that matched Lydia's own. And impossibly, miraculously, it formed a single fruit. Lydia discovered it on a morning in late August, when the drought had been going for 6 weeks and everyone was gaunt and tired. She'd been checking the plant purely out of habit, not really expecting to find anything, and there it was, a small, hard green tomato, no bigger than her thumb. She called Grant, her voice shaking. He came running, thinking something was wrong, and found her kneeling in the dirt, cupping the tiny tomato in her palm like it was made of glass. "Look," she whispered, "look what survived." Grant knelt beside her, and his eyes were bright as he stared at that impossible fruit. "Well, I'll be damned." They watched it every day after that, all of them, charting its slow transformation from green to gold to red. It grew larger, improbably large for a plant so stressed and struggling. Peter named it Thomas, because it wouldn't die even when it should, which made Lydia laugh despite herself. They talked about what they'd do when it ripened, how they'd celebrate this small miracle. But before the tomato could fully ripen, Grant got sick. It came on suddenly, the way these things often did. One morning he was fine, headed out to the timber site with his axe and his determination. By noon, James came running back to the cabin, terrified, saying Papa had collapsed and couldn't stand up. Lydia ran. She left everything, the garden, the laundry, Lily crying on the porch, and ran faster than she'd ever run in her life. She found Grant propped against a tree, his face gray and sweating, his eyes glassy with fever. "I'm fine," he tried to say, but the words slurred together. "Just need a minute." "You're burning up." Lydia pressed her hand to his forehead and felt the heat radiating from his skin. "James, help me get him to the wagon." Between the two of them, they managed to get Grant into the cart. He passed out halfway home, his body going limp against Lydia's side, and she had to fight down the panic that threatened to choke her. Not him. Please, God, not him. She'd already lost so much, she couldn't lose the man who taught her what it meant to be valued. They got him into bed, and Lydia began the familiar routine of fighting fever. Cool cloths, willow bark tea, constant monitoring. Grant drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to recognize her, sometimes lost in delirious dreams where he called for Anna and didn't seem to know where he was. The children were terrified. They'd watched their mother die, and now their father was slipping away from them, and no amount of Lydia's reassurance could completely ease their fear. Sarah tried to be brave, taking care of Lily and keeping the boys occupied, but Lydia could hear her crying at night in the loft. For 3 days, Grant burned. Lydia barely left his side, sleeping in a chair by the bed when exhaustion forced her to rest, waking every hour to check on him. She forced water and medicine down his throat when he could swallow. She changed his sweat-soaked sheets and bathed his burning skin. She talked to him constantly, telling him stories about the children, about the garden, about the life they were building together, reminding him that he was needed, that he had to fight. On the 4th morning, the fever finally broke. Grant opened his eyes, clear eyes, seeing eyes, and found Lydia slumped in her chair, her hand wrapped around his, her face gaunt with exhaustion. "Lydia," he croaked. She jerked awake, and when she saw him looking at her with recognition, she burst into tears. "Thank God. Thank God." "How long?" 4 days. You've been sick for 4 days. We thought—" Her voice broke. "The children thought they were going to lose you." "Not that easy to get rid of me." He tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "Water?" She helped him drink, supporting his head while he sipped slowly. His hand, when he raised it to steady the cup, was shaking and weak. "You scared us," she said quietly. "You scared me. I'm sorry." Grant's gray eyes met hers, and they were tired but warm. "You saved me. Again. You'd do the same for me." "I would. I will." He squeezed her hand weakly. "Till death do us part, remember?" "Don't joke about death right now. I'm still too angry at you for almost dying." He managed a real smile at that, and then fell back asleep, But this time it was natural sleep, not the fever-driven unconsciousness that had held him captive. Lydia sat with him until she was sure he was truly resting, then went to tell the children their father was going to be all right. Grant's recovery was slow. The fever had taken everything out of him, left him weak as a newborn and frustrated by his own limitations. He tried to go back to work after a week, made it halfway to the timber site, and collapsed again. Lydia found him sitting on a stump, his head in his hands, and she didn't say anything. She just sat beside him until he was ready to admit defeat and come home. "I can't provide for us like this," he said one evening, his voice bitter. "We're going to run out of supplies before winter. The timber contracts are going unfulfilled. We'll lose everything." "We'll figure it out." Lydia kept her voice calm, even though the same fears gnawed at her. "You're getting stronger every day, and we're not going to starve. I'll make sure of it." She meant it too. While Grant slowly regained his strength, Lydia became a force of nature. She hunted rabbits with the old rifle Grant had taught her to use. She gathered every edible plant she could find, berries, nuts, wild greens. She negotiated with neighbors, trading her healing skills for food and supplies. She took in mending work from town, staying up late by lamplight to earn a few extra coins. The children helped however they could, and together they kept the household afloat. And through it all, impossibly, that single tomato continued to ripen. It became a symbol for all of them, proof that something could survive even when everything else was dying. They checked on it religiously, protected it from birds and insects, whispered encouragement as if the plant could hear them. By early September, it was fully red and perfect, the size of Lydia's fist, heavy with juice and promise. "Tomorrow," Lydia declared one evening, "tomorrow we harvest it and we share it, all of us together." Grant was well enough by then to sit at the table for meals, though he still tired easily. He looked at Lydia across the table, and his expression was soft with love. "Your garden survived, Lydia. You made something grow where nothing should have grown. One tomato out of an entire garden, that's not much of a victory." "It's everything." His voice was firm. "You could have given up. You should have given up, but you didn't. You kept fighting for it, kept believing in it, even when everyone told you it was hopeless. That tomato is proof that faith matters, that stubbornness matters, that you matter." The next morning, Lydia went out to harvest the tomato. She cut it carefully from the vine, cradling it in both hands like the treasure it was. She brought it inside and set it on the table, and the whole family gathered around to stare at this impossible fruit that had survived drought and heat and every reason to fail. "How do we do this?" Sarah asked. Lydia took a knife and cut the tomato into 6 perfect slices, one for each of them. They were thin, barely enough to taste, but when she distributed them and they all bit down together, the flavor exploded across their tongues. Sweet and tart and sun-warmed, tasting like victory and survival and the stubborn refusal to surrender. Peter closed his eyes and hummed with pleasure. James declared it the best thing he'd ever eaten. Lily's face split into a huge smile, juice running down her chin. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Lydia's hand, her eyes saying what her voice couldn't. Grant ate his slice slowly, savoring every moment. When he was done, he reached for Lydia's hands, blistered and rough from months of hauling water, scarred from thorns and hard work, and lifted them to his lips. He kissed each palm tenderly, reverently, and his eyes were wet when he looked at her. "You grew beauty where there was nothing," he said quietly. "You took cracked earth and impossible odds and made something perfect. That's who you are, Lydia. That's what you do. You make beauty from brokenness." She couldn't speak past the lump in her throat, so she just held his hands and let herself believe it. Maybe she was more than her failures. Maybe she was exactly what Grant said, someone who made beauty from brokenness, who refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier. Maybe that was enough. The drought finally broke in late September. Rain came in torrents, turning the cracked earth to mud, filling the creeks to overflowing, washing the brown from the pines. The land sighed with relief, and so did the Coulter family. Grant's strength returned fully, and he went back to work. Lydia planted a fall garden, smaller this time but still determined. The children went back to their normal routines, though they never quite lost the wariness that comes from surviving hard times. Life settled into a rhythm again, seasons turning like pages in a book. 2 years passed, then 3. The children grew. Sarah became a young woman, beautiful and capable, helping Lydia run the household. James grew tall and strong, working alongside his father. Peter lost his last baby tooth and learned to read. Lily started school, proudly carrying the lunch Lydia packed for her each morning. And Lydia became more herself than she'd ever been. She was Mama Lydia, the woman who could heal anything and grow anything and love fiercely enough to remake a broken family into something whole. The town slowly stopped whispering about her. New scandals replaced old ones, and eventually people just accepted that Lydia Coulter was Grant Coulter's wife, mother to his children, as natural as the mountains that ring the valley. Then, on a bright October morning 5 years after Lydia had stood on that auction block, 2 men in suits arrived at the cabin. Lydia was working in the garden, now lush and productive, rows of vegetables and herbs and flowers that she tended with the same fierce love she'd given that single tomato. She looked up when she heard horses, shading her eyes against the sun, and watched the strangers dismount. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" She stood, brushing dirt from her apron. The taller of the 2 men removed his hat. "Mrs. Coulter, we're representatives from the Northern Pacific Railway Company. Is your husband home?" "He's at the timber site. What's this about?" "We'd prefer to discuss it with Mr. Coulter present. When do you expect him back?" Lydia didn't like the way they'd ignored her question, talked around her like she didn't matter. It reminded her too much of Thomas, of her father, of all the men who'd treated her like she was invisible. "You can discuss it with me," she said firmly. "I'm his wife, his partner. Whatever you have to say to him, you can say to me." The 2 men exchanged glances. The shorter one stepped forward with a placating smile. "Ma'am, this is a matter of significant financial import. Your husband will want to hear this directly." "Then tell me, and I'll tell him. Or wait here until he comes home. Either way, I'm not going anywhere." The taller man sighed and pulled out a rolled map from his saddlebag. "Very well. The railway is planning a new line through this territory. We've surveyed the route, and I'm afraid the optimal path runs directly through your property, right here." He unrolled the map and pointed to a line that cut straight through the hillside where they stood, right through the garden, right through the small plot where Grant had buried his wife and Lydia had planted wildflowers. Lydia stared at the map, at the cold black line that would erase everything they'd built. "No. Ma'am, I understand this might be surprising, but the railway company is prepared to offer very generous compensation. We're talking about enough money to buy a new property, a better property, and still have plenty left over. This is an opportunity." I said no. The shorter man's smile faded. "Mrs. Coulter, perhaps you don't understand the significance. I understand perfectly. You want to destroy our home so you can run your trains through, and I'm telling you no. You can't refuse. We have the legal right to claim this land under eminent domain if necessary. We're trying to be fair about this, offering to pay you well above market value, but get off our property." Lydia's voice was cold as winter stone. "Right now. And don't come back." The men looked at each other again. The taller one started to roll up his map. "We'll need to speak with your husband. This isn't a decision a woman can make alone." "I'm not alone. I'm never alone. This land, this home, these are ours. Mine and Grant's and our children's. And I'm telling you it's not for sale. No amount of money will change that." She stood there in her garden, covered in dirt, her hands on her hips, and something in her expression must have convinced them she meant every word. They mounted their horses, tipped their hats with cold courtesy, and rode away. But Lydia knew they'd be back. Men like that always came back. Grant arrived home an hour later to find Lydia sitting on the porch, the rolled map in her lap, her expression distant. When she told him about the railway men, his face went hard as granite. "They want to take our land. They want to buy our land. There's a difference." "Not to me." Grant sat down beside her, took the map, and studied it. His jaw clenched when he saw how the proposed line cut right through their property. "They want to destroy everything, the cabin, the garden, Anna's grave, everything." "We could use the money," Lydia said quietly, playing devil's advocate even though every fiber of her being rebelled against the idea. "We could start over somewhere else, somewhere easier, with better land closer to town." Grant was silent for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to the edge of the porch, and looked out over the land they'd fought so hard to keep. The garden where Lydia had grown beauty from brokenness. The clearing where the children played. The hillside where Anna rested beneath wildflowers. The pines that whispered secrets in the wind. "No," he said finally, his voice absolute. "This land is not for sale." "Grant? Lydia, I bought you on an auction block 5 years ago. Do you remember what I said? You said I wouldn't be judged anymore. I said someone was allowed to stay. You were allowed to stay here, on this land, in this home. You were allowed to belong somewhere without having to prove your worth or earn your keep through suffering. This place," his voice cracked slightly, "this place gave you that. It gave you permission to just be. And now some railway company wants to come in with their maps and their money and take that away? No, absolutely not." Lydia stood and moved to his side. "They said they have legal rights. Eminent domain. Then they'll have to drag us off this land. Because I'm not leaving. I'm not selling. This is where Anna rests. This is where you learned you weren't broken. This is where our children learn to trust again. This land holds all of that, Lydia. All the pain and healing and growth. You can't put a price on that." She thought about the single tomato, about hauling water until her shoulders screamed, about refusing to give up even when everyone said she should. She thought about the garden she tended every day, about the wildflowers on Anna's grave, about 4 children who called her mama and meant it. "You're right," she said quietly. "It's not for sale." Grant pulled her close, and they stood together watching the sun sink toward the mountains. Behind them, they could hear the children inside the cabin. Sarah singing while she cooked, the boys arguing about something trivial, Lily's laughter bright as bells. "We'll fight them," Grant said. "However long it takes, whatever it costs. This land stays ours." The railway men came back 3 more times over the following weeks, each time with higher offers, more legal threats, more pressure. Grant refused them all with the same steady certainty. The 4th time, he walked out to meet them before they could even dismount, and there was something in his bearing that made them nervous. "Gentlemen, I'm going to save us all some time. My answer is no. It will always be no. You can offer me all the money in the world, you can threaten me with every law you've got, and my answer will still be no. This land is not for sale. Someone was once allowed to stay here. That is enough." The taller man frowned. "Mr. Coulter, you're being unreasonable. The railroad is progress. It's the future. You can't stand in the way of—" "Watch me." Grant's voice was flat, final. "Now get off my property, and if you come back, you'll regret it." That night, Grant and Lydia worked by lamplight, carving words into a flat piece of pine that Grant had planed smooth. When they were finished, they nailed it to a post at the end of the road leading to their property, where anyone approaching would see it clearly. The sign read simply, "Not for sale. Someone was once allowed to stay here. That is enough." And beneath it, in Lydia's careful hand, "This land holds our healing. It is not for purchase." The railway company tried legal action. They sent lawyers and surveyors and men with official-looking documents. But Grant stood firm, and when the case finally went before the territorial judge, something unexpected happened. Other families spoke up, neighbors whose land would also be affected, townspeople who didn't want to see the Coulters forced out, even Mrs. Patterson from the general store who testified that Grant Coulter was the most honest man she knew, and if he said his land wasn't for sale, then it wasn't for sale. The judge ruled in their favor. The railway would have to route around the Coulter property, not through it. It would cost them more money and more time, but that wasn't the Coulters' problem. Their land, their home, their healing, all of it would remain untouched. When Grant brought the news home, Lydia was in the garden, naturally. She looked up at him with dirt on her face and hope in her eyes, and when he nodded, she dropped her trowel and flew into his arms. The children came running from all directions, shouting and celebrating, and they all stood there in the garden that had survived drought and doubt, holding each other and knowing they'd won something more valuable than money. They'd won the right to stay, to belong, to build their lives on land that had given them permission to heal. That night, after the children were asleep, Grant and Lydia sat on the porch in the darkness. The sign was barely visible in the moonlight, but they knew it was there, standing guard over everything they'd fought for. "Thank you," Grant said quietly. "For what?" for fighting with me, for believing this place was worth saving, for understanding why I couldn't let them take it. Lydia reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. This is where I learned I was more than my failures. This is where I became Mama. This is where I found you. Of course it was worth fighting for. I love you, Grant said, and it was the first time he'd spoken those words aloud. I don't say it enough. I should say it more. But I love you, Lydia. Not because you saved my life or my children's lives, but because you're you. Because you grow beauty from brokenness and refuse to surrender even when everything's dying. Because you're the strongest person I've ever known. Lydia felt tears slip down her cheeks. I love you too. I think I have for a while now. I was just scared to say it, scared I'd jinx it somehow. We don't believe in jinxes here. Grant pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. We believe in stubborn tomatoes and second chances and land that refuses to be sold. They sat there together, watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to the pines whisper their secrets. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. The creek murmured its endless song, and on a post at the end of the road, a sign proclaimed their truth to anyone who would listen. Not for sale. Someone was once allowed to stay here. That is enough. The years rolled forward like water over stones, each one smoothing rough edges, wearing away old hurts, revealing something beautiful underneath. Lydia watched the seasons turn with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read the land's moods, when to plant, when to harvest, when to simply let things rest and trust they'd return in spring. Sarah was the first to leave home, though she didn't go far. At 18, she married Daniel Garrett, a young carpenter from town who'd been courting her for 2 years with Grant's cautious approval. The wedding was held in the clearing beside the cabin, under the pines where Lydia had first learned what it meant to be fought for. Sarah wore her mother Anna's wedding dress, carefully preserved all these years, and when Grant walked her down the makeshift aisle, there wasn't a dry eye among the witnesses. But it was what Sarah said during the ceremony that broke Lydia completely. When Reverend Carson asked who gave this woman to be married, Grant had opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah turned to look back at Lydia standing with the other children. Both my parents give me, Sarah said firmly, her voice carrying across the clearing, my papa who raised me and my mama who chose me. Lydia pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Sarah had never called her Mama directly before. It had always been Mama Lydia, a careful designation that honored both women who'd shaped her. But now, in this moment that mattered most, Sarah was claiming her fully. Not as a replacement for Anna, but as a second mother whose love was just as real, just as valid. After the ceremony, Sarah found Lydia in the garden, where else, and hugged her fiercely. Thank you, she whispered, for everything, for staying when it would have been easier to leave, for loving us when we didn't know how to let you, for teaching me that mothers are made through choice, not just blood. You made it easy to love you, Lydia managed through her tears. All of you did, once you let me close enough to try. Sarah and Daniel built a small house just over the ridge, close enough that Sarah could visit daily, far enough that they had their own space to build their life. Within a year, she was pregnant, and Lydia found herself in the strange position of preparing to become a grandmother to a child who carried none of her blood, but all of her heart. The baby came on a summer morning, and Lydia was there to help deliver her, a healthy girl with her mother's dark hair and her father's gentle eyes. Sarah, exhausted and radiant, held her daughter close and looked at Lydia with profound gratitude. We're naming her Anna Lydia, she said softly, after both my mothers, so she'll carry both your strengths forward. Lydia held her granddaughter and felt something complete itself inside her chest. This tiny person, born from a child she hadn't given birth to, but had raised nonetheless, connected to her through choice and love rather than biology. She thought about all those years ago, standing on an auction block, being told she was worthless because her womb was empty. And now here she was, holding her granddaughter, a grandmother in every way that mattered. Hello, Anna Lydia, she whispered to the baby. Welcome to this family that chooses its own. James left next, at 20, to work on a ranch 3 valleys over. It wasn't far, but it was the first time one of the children had truly left, and the cabin felt emptier without his steady presence. He came home for Christmas that first year with a young woman named Margaret, shy and sweet, and announced they'd be married in the spring. Peter, now 13 and full of mischief, teased his brother mercilessly until James tackled him into a snowdrift, both of them laughing like the boys they'd been. Peter himself was growing into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, with a gentle heart that drew animals and small children to him like a magnet. He'd decided he wanted to be a veterinarian, wanted to go to school in the city and learn how to heal creatures the way Lydia had taught him to heal people. Grant was skeptical about the expense, but Lydia had been setting aside money for years, coins saved from her healing work and her garden produce, tucked away in a tin for this exact purpose. He should follow his dream, she told Grant one evening as they discussed it. We have enough. We'll always have enough. That money was supposed to be for emergencies. This is an emergency. Our boy has a calling, and we have the means to help him answer it. That's not wasting money. That's investing in who he's meant to become. So Peter went to school, coming home summers to work alongside his father and practice his growing skills on the farm animals and wild creatures that people brought to him. He wrote letters full of wonder about anatomy and medicine, about professors who challenged him and classmates who became friends. And in every letter, he signed off the same way. Your loving son, Peter Coulter. Your son. Not Grant's son. Not even our son. Just Lydia's son. Claimed absolutely and without qualification. Lily, the baby who'd called her mama first, grew into a beautiful young woman with Anna's golden curls and a mind as sharp as any Lydia had encountered. She loved school, loved learning, and by 15 she was assisting the teacher with the younger children. One afternoon she came home with a paper in her hand and a peculiar expression on her face. Mama, the teacher asked us to write our family histories, she said, sitting down at the kitchen table where Lydia was kneading bread. I need to fill out this form for the school records. It asks for our parents' full names. Lydia's hand stilled in the dough. All right. I wrote Papa's name, Grant Coulter. Lily's voice was careful, gentle. And then I wrote your name, Lydia Coulter. But the teacher said I needed to write my birth mother's name too for the records. She said Anna should be listed as my mother. The teacher's right, Lydia said quietly. Anna was your mother. She gave you life. But you gave me everything else. Lily's eyes were fierce. You were there when I was sick. You taught me to read. You braided my hair every morning and sang me to sleep every night. You're the mama I remember. You're the one who counts. Lily, I don't want to erase Anna. I'm not trying to erase her. I'm trying to claim you. Lily pushed the paper across the table. Look what I wrote under Mother. I wrote both names. Anna Coulter, deceased. Lydia Coulter, living. Because I had two mothers. One who gave me life and one who taught me how to live it. Why should I have to choose? Lydia looked down at the paper at Lily's careful handwriting listing both women as her mothers, and something that had been tightly wound in her chest for years finally loosened. You shouldn't have to choose. You're right. You're absolutely right. So it's okay. The teacher said it was irregular, but I told her irregular is just another word for honest. Lydia laughed, pulling Lily into a flowery hug. You're remarkable. Do you know that? You're going to do extraordinary things. And she did. Lily became a teacher herself, opening a small school for the children of trappers and loggers who lived too far from town for regular schooling. She never married. I'm married to my students, she'd say with a smile. But she filled her life with purpose and meaning, and Lydia couldn't have been prouder. The years accumulated like snow on the mountains, each one adding to the sum of their shared life. Grandchildren arrived. Sarah and Daniel had 3 more. James and Margaret had 4. Even Peter eventually married a fellow veterinarian and brought her home to meet the family. The cabin expanded to accommodate family gatherings. Grant and James adding rooms and a larger porch where everyone could congregate on summer evenings. Through it all, Lydia tended her garden. It became legendary in the territory. People would ride for hours to see it, to buy her produce, to ask her advice on their own struggling plots. She grew tomatoes that weighed 2 pounds each, beans that climbed to the cabin roof, herbs that could cure everything from headaches to heartbreak. But more than that, she grew healing there. Women came to her with their troubles, and somehow, working side by side in the dirt, problems became bearable. Couples on the brink of divorce found common ground while weeding her rows. Children who'd lost parents found comfort among her sunflowers. The garden became what Lydia had become, a place where broken things learned to grow again. One autumn day, when Lily was home visiting and helping with the harvest, she found her mother sitting on the bench Grant had built years ago, overlooking the garden in its late-season glory. "Mama, you all right?" Lydia looked up and smiled. "Just thinking, remembering." "Remembering what?" "The day your father bought me, standing on that auction block, thinking my life was over, thinking I was worth less than an old horse." She shook her head, still marveling at how far she'd come. "I couldn't have imagined this, any of this." Lily sat beside her, taking her hand. "I'm glad Papa saw what everyone else missed. He saw someone who needed saving, but really, we saved each other." Lydia squeezed her daughter's hand. "He gave me a place to belong, and I gave him what? I've never been quite sure what I gave him that was equal to what he gave me." "Mama." Lily's voice was gentle but firm. "You gave him everything. You gave him a partner when he was drowning in responsibility. You gave his children a mother when they'd lost hope. You gave this family a heart again. Don't you understand? Papa bought you thinking he was getting help with the housework, and instead he got the foundation that holds all of us together." That evening, Grant found Lydia in the garden as the sun set behind the mountains. He'd been doing this for years now, joining her for the last light of day, talking about nothing and everything while the world quieted around them. "Lily thinks I don't understand what I gave you," Lydia said without preamble. Grant settled onto the bench beside her. "What do you think you gave me?" "I don't know. Work, help with the children, someone to share the burden." Lydia Monroe Coulter. Grant took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle on hers. "You gave me hope. You gave me proof that broken things can be fixed. You gave me a reason to believe in second chances. You took 4 angry, hurt children and loved them until they remembered how to love back. You made this cabin into a home. You made me into someone who smiles again. Don't you dare diminish that." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence while darkness gathered around them. After a while, Grant spoke again. "I got you something." "Grant, it's not Christmas." "I know. Just open it." He handed her a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, blank pages waiting to be filled. Lydia looked at him questioningly. "I want you to write," he said. "Whatever you want, your story, our story, recipes and healing remedies, advice for the grandchildren. Whatever life you want to remember or imagine, write it down, so it's not lost, so everyone knows what you overcame." Lydia opened the notebook to the first page, running her hand over the clean paper. And there, in the fading light, she wrote her first entry. "Today is the first day I was loved without having to give birth to anyone." She showed Grant, and he read it with tears in his eyes. "You gave birth to all of us anyway," he said quietly. "Just not the way they said you had to." Lydia filled that notebook over the following years. She wrote about her mother's healing remedies and her own hard-won wisdom. She wrote stories about each of her children, memories she wanted preserved. She wrote about the drought and the single tomato, about fighting the railway company, about learning that worth wasn't measured in babies born, but in love given freely. And on the last page, she wrote a message for her children and grandchildren. Remember that family is something you choose and build, not something you're born into. Blood makes you related. Love makes you family. Time continued its inexorable march. Grant's hair turned white. Lydia's hands became arthritic and gnarled from years of garden work. But they were happy, genuinely happy, in the way that people who've built something real together are happy. They'd grown old side by side, weathering storms and droughts, and all the small disasters of living, and they'd emerged stronger for it. Lydia was 73 when she got sick. It started small, a cough that wouldn't leave, a fatigue that rest didn't cure. By winter, she knew what it was, even if she didn't say it aloud. Her mother had died of the same thing, a growth in the lungs that no amount of willow bark or prayer could stop. She kept working as long as she could, determined to tend her garden through one more season. Grant watched her with increasing worry, and finally one morning he found her collapsed among the bean plants, too weak to stand. "That's enough," he said, his voice rough with fear. No more garden. You rest. But the plants, damn the plants. I need you more than they do. The children came home, all of them, gathering like birds returning to roost. Sarah brought Anna Lydia, now a young woman herself with children of her own. James brought his family from the ranch. Peter left his veterinary practice in the city. Lily closed her school for a week. They filled the cabin with noise and life and love, and Lydia lay in the bed she'd shared with Grant for decades, surrounded by the family she'd built from choice and stubbornness. "I'm sorry," she told them one evening when they were all gathered around her. "I'm sorry I can't stay longer." "Mama, don't apologize," Sarah said, gripping her hand. "You've given us everything. I wish I could have given you more years." "You gave us exactly what we needed." James's voice was thick with tears. "You gave us a mother when we'd lost ours. You gave us stability and love and proof that people can change, can heal. That's more than enough." Peter knelt by the bed, his veterinarian's hands gentle on her wrist as if checking a pulse. "You taught me that healing isn't just about fixing bodies. It's about fixing hearts and families and all the broken places people carry inside them. That's what you've been doing all along, Mama, healing all of us." Lily simply climbed onto the bed and curled against Lydia's side like she had as a small child. "I love you, Mama. Thank you for choosing us." "I didn't choose you," Lydia whispered, running her fingers through Lily's golden hair. "You were always mine. From the moment your father brought me to this cabin and I saw 4 scared children on the porch, you were mine. I just had to prove I deserved you." "You never had to prove anything," Grant said from his chair beside the bed. He'd barely left her side in days. "You belonged here from the beginning. I knew it when I saw you on that auction block. I knew you were supposed to be ours." The end came on a spring morning, appropriately. The garden was just beginning to wake up, green shoots pushing through the last of winter's snow. Grant was holding Lydia's hand, had been holding it all night, when she opened her eyes one last time. "Grant? I'm here, love. I'm right here. The garden is beautiful. Always will be. You made sure of that." She smiled faintly. "Did I do all right? As a mother? As a wife?" "You did more than all right. You remade all of us. You took broken pieces and built something whole." His voice cracked. "You're the best thing that ever happened to this family. Take care of them. Promise me." "I promise. But you know they don't need taking care of anymore. You raised them too well for that." Lydia's eyes found each of her children in turn, Sarah weeping quietly, James standing strong, Peter with his hand over his heart, Lily still pressed against her side. "I love you," she whispered. "All of you, so much." "We love you too, Mama," they said in chorus. And those were the last words Lydia heard before she slipped away, her hand still wrapped in Grant's, her family surrounding her with the love she'd spent a lifetime earning. They buried her under the apple tree at the edge of her garden, the tree that produced the sweetest fruit in the territory. Grant carved her headstone himself, working through the night with tears running down his weathered face. When he was finished, the stone read, "Lydia Monroe Coulter. Here grew everything she was never given, and all that she gave anyway." The funeral drew half the territory. People came who Lydia had healed, whose children she'd taught, whose gardens she'd advised, whose broken hearts she'd mended with patience and wisdom. They stood around her grave and told stories about her kindness, her stubbornness, her absolute refusal to accept that broken meant worthless. Grant stood with his children and grandchildren, accepting condolences with the numb courtesy of someone whose world had fundamentally shifted. After everyone else had left, after the children had returned to the cabin to begin the painful work of sorting through their mother's things, Grant stayed by the grave alone. "I should have told you more," he said to the freshly turned earth. "Should have said I loved you every day instead of just showing it. Should have thanked you for every meal, every healed wound, every moment you chose to stay when you could have left." He wiped his eyes roughly. "You remade me, Lydia. I was just surviving before you, just getting through each day. But you taught me how to live again, how to hope, how to believe in second chances." His voice dropped to a whisper. "You didn't bear my blood, but you gave birth to the rest of my life." He visited her grave every day after that, talking to her about the garden, the children, the grandchildren who kept coming to visit. He tended the apple tree with the same fierce devotion Lydia had shown, making sure it never wanted for water or care. The garden continued to bloom under his attention, though everyone agreed it wasn't quite the same without Lydia's touch. Grant lived 2 more years, and they were good years despite the loneliness. He saw Sarah's youngest grandchild born. He watched Peter open his own veterinary practice. He walked Lily down the aisle when she finally, at 48, decided to marry after all. He was there for all of it, a steady presence, the patriarch of a family that had been remade through love and choice. But on a quiet autumn morning, James found him in the garden, slumped on Lydia's bench, his hand reaching toward the apple tree as if to touch her. He died peacefully, in the place he loved most, surrounded by the beauty his wife had created. They buried him beside Lydia, and on his stone they carved the words he'd whispered at her grave. "She didn't bear my blood, but she gave birth to the rest of my life." The years rolled on. The cabin became a gathering place for the extended Coulter family, carefully maintained by Sarah and her children, then by Anna Lydia and her children. The garden continued to bloom, tended by generations who learned the lessons Lydia had taught, that persistence matters, that beauty can grow from brokenness, that love is a choice you make every day. The railway line had been completed years ago, but it bent around the Coulter property, following a longer, more expensive route because one stubborn family had refused to be moved. Travelers passing through would sometimes stop to read the weathered sign that still stood at the end of the road. Not for sale. Someone was once allowed to stay here. That is enough. And beneath the sign, someone, probably Grant, probably in those last years after Lydia died, had added a new carving. It was rough, done with a shaking hand, but the words were clear. "She didn't bear my blood, but she gave birth to the rest of my life." People would read those words and ask what they meant. The Coulter grandchildren would smile and tell the story of Lydia Monroe, who'd been sold at auction as a barren woman, worthless and broken, and who'd become the foundation of a family that chose love over blood, persistence over surrender, healing over bitterness. They'd talk about the garden that survived drought, about 4 children who learned to call a stranger mama, about a man who saw value where everyone else saw failure, about a woman who proved that worth isn't measured in what your body can produce, but in what your heart can give. And always, always, they'd end with the same truth, that Lydia had never borne children from her own womb, but she'd given birth to something more lasting, a family built on choice, a legacy of healing, and the unshakable belief that every person deserves a place to belong and permission to simply be enough. The apple tree grew tall and strong over their graves, its roots intertwined with theirs, its branches heavy with fruit each fall. The garden bloomed year after year, tended by loving hands that remembered the lessons Lydia had taught. And on that dry Montana hillside, where a broken woman had once learned to be whole, the story continued, not ending, never ending, but transforming into something eternal. The sign still stands there today, weathered but legible, a testament to the woman who refused to be sold, the family who chose to be made, and the truth that sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones that can't be purchased, only grown. Not for sale. Someone was once allowed to stay here. That is enough.